No water can clean your rotten nature. My mother-in-law screamed while I was getting out of the shower. Right after, my husband destroyed our wedding album and threw me into the street with only a towel. Father-in-law added, "Some women just don't deserve decent treatment." But they didn't imagine that my father, the real owner of my husband's company, was arriving at the house. When he saw me like this, he got out of the car in silence. What he did next left them all trembling. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how my world collapsed and was rebuilt in the most unexpected way. It all started on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I had been married to Michael for 3 years, and we lived with his parents, Robert and Linda, in their large suburban home. The arrangement wasn't ideal, but Michael insisted it was temporary while we saved for our own place. What I didn't realize was that this living situation was slowly poisoning our marriage. Linda had never liked me from the moment Michael brought me home. She made snide comments about my cooking, my cleaning, my appearance, and basically everything I did. Robert, her husband, was quieter but equally dismissive. He had this way of looking through me as if I didn't exist, and when he did acknowledge me, it was usually to criticize something. Michael, who had been my college sweetheart, seemed to transform whenever we were around his parents. The loving, supportive man I married became distant and increasingly critical. He started agreeing with his mother's complaints and joining in on the subtle put-downs. Looking back now, I realized there had been warning signs even in college, times when he would dismiss my opinions if they conflicted with his friends, or how he always seemed to need validation from authority figures. But love made me overlook these red flags. I told myself it was just stress from living with family, that things would get better once we moved out. I was so wrong. That Tuesday, I had spent the morning cleaning the house from top to bottom. Linda had mentioned that some of her book club friends were coming over, and she made it clear that the house needed to be presentable. I vacuumed, dusted, scrubbed bathrooms, and even organized the already organized pantry. By the time I finished, I was exhausted and covered in cleaning products and dust. Around 2 in the afternoon, I decided to take a quick shower before Linda's friends arrived. I wanted to look decent when I met them, knowing that Linda would find fault with my appearance if I didn't. Michael had always encouraged me to use the master bathroom since the guest bathroom shower had poor water pressure and barely stayed warm. I gathered my clothes and headed to the master bathroom. The shower felt amazing after hours of cleaning. The hot water washed away my fatigue, and for the first time that day, I felt relaxed. I took my time, using my favorite lavender body wash and letting the steam ease the tension in my shoulders. I was thinking about dinner plans when I heard voices outside the bathroom door. At first, I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was angry. I turned off the water and grabbed my towel, wrapping it around myself. I listened more carefully. That's when I heard Michael's voice, loud and furious. "She's been using our bathroom again. I told her to use the guest bathroom, but she thinks she can just do whatever she wants in this house." My heart sank. Michael had always told me to use the master bathroom because the guest bathroom shower had poor water pressure and temperature control. We had never discussed any restriction about it. In fact, just last week he had reminded me to use the good shower when I mentioned the guest bathroom was acting up again. "That woman has no respect," Linda's voice cut through the door like a knife. "She acts like she owns this place when she contributes absolutely nothing. She doesn't even have a real job." I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation. I worked as a freelance graphic designer from home, and while my income wasn't huge, I contributed to household expenses and did most of the housework. But Linda had always dismissed my work as playing on the computer. "Maybe it's time we had a serious conversation with her," Robert's voice joined in, cold and calculating. "She needs to learn her place in this family." I stood there in my towel, dripping wet and shaking with a combination of cold and shock. These people I had been living with for months, trying so hard to please and win over, were talking about me like I was some unwanted pest they needed to exterminate. I took a deep breath and opened the bathroom door, hoping to diffuse the situation with humor or at least explain myself. But the moment I stepped out, Linda's face twisted with rage. "There she is!" she screamed, her voice so loud and sudden that I jumped backward. "Look at her, prancing around this house like she owns it. Using our bathroom, wasting our water, taking hour-long showers while the rest of us wait." "I was only in there for 15 minutes, I stammered, clutching my towel tighter around myself. "I was cleaning all morning and just wanted to wash off the dust and, don't you dare make excuses." Linda's face was red with fury, and tiny droplets of spit flew from her mouth as she yelled. "You think we don't see what you're doing? You think you can just waltz around here, using everything like it's yours?" Michael stood behind his mother, his arms crossed, and his face set in an expression I had never seen before. It was cold, disgusted, like he was looking at something repulsive. "Michael," I said, my voice pleading, "can we talk about this privately? I don't understand what's wrong. I thought it was okay to use the bathroom. You never said, 'Don't bring me into your lies,'" he cut me off sharply. "I'm tired of making excuses for you. I'm tired of pretending that this is working." My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" Linda stepped closer to me, her eyes blazing with hatred that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You want to know what's wrong with you? Everything. You're lazy, you're selfish, you think you're better than us because your daddy has money, but money can't buy class, honey. Money can't buy decency. No water can clean your rotten nature." She screamed, her voice echoing through the hallway. "You could shower for a week straight and you'd still be the same worthless, spoiled brat who thinks the world owes her everything." I felt like I had been slapped. The venom in her voice, the pure hatred radiating from her, left me speechless. I looked at Michael desperately, waiting for him to defend me, to tell his mother she was out of line. Instead, he walked past me into our bedroom and came back out carrying our wedding album. My stomach dropped as I realized what was about to happen. "Michael, no," I whispered, but he was already opening the beautiful leather-bound album that we had spent hours putting together after our wedding. "You want to know what I think about our marriage?" he said, his voice eerily calm. "This is what I think about our marriage." He ripped the first page out, tearing our wedding photos in half. The picture of us kissing at the altar, the one where we were laughing during the first dance, the candid shots of us with our friends and family, he destroyed them all, page by page, photo by photo. These were the special prints we had made for this album. While we had digital copies stored somewhere, these particular photos with their special cropping and professional printing were irreplaceable. I watched in horror as 3 years of memories were reduced to scraps of paper scattered across the floor. "Stop," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "Please stop, these special prints can't be replaced." But he kept going, methodically destroying every image of our wedding day. When he reached the last page, he looked up at me with those cold eyes and said, "There. That's how much our marriage means to me." Linda clapped her hands together like she was watching a performance. Finally, you're showing some backbone, Michael. I was wondering when you'd stop letting this girl walk all over you." Robert, who had been silent throughout this whole exchange, finally spoke up. His voice was quiet but carried a weight that made my blood run cold. "Some women just don't deserve decent treatment," he said, looking directly at me. "Some women need to be put in their place before they understand how the world really works." I felt like I was living in a nightmare. These people, who I had been living with, sharing meals with, trying to build a relationship with, were treating me like I was less than human. And my husband, the man I had pledged to love and honor, was leading the charge. "Get out," Michael said suddenly. "What?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Get out of this house. Now. Today. Michael, I'm your wife. We can work through this. Whatever I did wrong, we can fix it. Let's just talk." "There's nothing to talk about," he interrupted. "I want you gone. Pack your things and leave." I looked down at myself, still dripping wet in just a towel. "Can I at least get dressed? Get my things?" Linda laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You can get your things later. Right now, you need to leave. We've had enough of your drama for one day." "I'm not wearing clothes," I said desperately. "I can't go outside like this." "Not our problem," Michael said, and I barely recognized the man I had married. "You should have thought about that before you decided to cause a scene." I didn't cause a scene. I was just taking a shower. But they weren't listening anymore. Michael grabbed my arm and started pulling me toward the front door. I struggled, trying to break free, but his grip was too strong. "Let me get dressed," I pleaded. "At least let me put on some clothes. Please, I'm begging you." "You can figure it out," he said, and I heard the front door open. The next thing I knew, I was standing on the front porch in nothing but a towel, watching my husband close the door in my face. I heard the deadbolt click into place, and then silence. I stood there for a moment, unable to process what had just happened. It was March, still cold, and the wind cut through my damp towel like ice. I was barefoot on the concrete porch, holding a towel around myself, with nowhere to go and no way to get there. I tried the door, but it was locked. I knocked, then pounded, but no one answered. I could hear them talking inside, their voices casual now, like they had just taken out the trash and were moving on with their day. Panic started to set in. I was essentially naked on a suburban street in the middle of the afternoon. I had no phone, no money, no car keys, nothing. I thought about going to a neighbor's house, but I barely knew any of them, and the thought of having to explain why I was standing at their door in a towel was mortifying. I sat down on the porch steps, trying to think of what to do. I could walk to the nearest store and ask to use their phone, but it was at least a mile away, and I wasn't sure the towel would stay secure for that long. Plus, who would I call? My friends lived across town, and I didn't know any of their numbers by heart. That's when I remembered that my father was supposed to visit that afternoon. My father, David, was a successful businessman who owned several companies. Michael worked for one of them, though he had always claimed he got the job on his own merit. Dad had mentioned that morning that he wanted to drop by to see how we were doing and maybe take us to dinner. I had completely forgotten in the chaos of cleaning and then everything that followed. But as I sat there shivering on the porch, I realized he might be my only hope. He usually visited around 4 o'clock, and it was almost 4 now. I tried to position myself so that I wouldn't be visible to passing cars while still being able to see the street. Every minute felt like an hour. My teeth were chattering, and my feet were numb from the cold concrete. I kept thinking this had to be some kind of horrible dream, that I would wake up and find myself back in my warm bed with my loving husband. But the cold was too real, the humiliation too sharp. This was actually happening. At exactly 4:15, I saw a familiar black Mercedes turning onto the street. My heart jumped with relief and terror at the same time. Relief because I would finally be rescued from this nightmare, and terror because my father would see me like this, sitting on a porch in a towel, clearly having been thrown out of my own home. The car pulled into the driveway, and I watched my father get out. David Peterson was a distinguished man in his 50s, always impeccably dressed and composed. He had built his business empire from nothing, and everyone who knew him respected his quiet strength and sharp intelligence. He looked up at the house and saw me sitting on the porch. For a moment, he just stood there, taking in the scene. I watched his expression change from confusion to concern to something much darker. He didn't say a word. He just walked up the porch steps, took off his suit jacket, and wrapped it around my shoulders. It was warm from his body heat and smelled like his cologne, familiar and comforting. "Dad," I whispered, and my voice broke. "Not here," he said quietly. "Not yet." He helped me to my feet and guided me to his car. He opened the passenger door, made sure I was seated comfortably, and then walked back up to the front door of the house. I watched from the car as he rang the doorbell. Michael answered, and I could see his face go white when he realized who was standing on his porch. They had a brief conversation that I couldn't hear, but I could see Michael gesturing, probably trying to explain what had happened. My father listened without expression, nodded once, and then walked back to the car. He got in, started the engine, and drove away without a word. We went to his house, a beautiful place about 20 minutes away. Dad's housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, was there, and she immediately took charge, bringing me warm clothes, tea, and a blanket. She didn't ask any questions, just made sure I was comfortable and warm. Dad disappeared into his office for about an hour. I could hear him on the phone, his voice low and serious. I didn't try to listen in, I was too exhausted and emotionally drained to process much of anything. When he finally came out, he sat down across from me in his living room and asked me to tell him everything that had happened. So I did. I started with the months of subtle hostility from Linda and Robert, Michael's gradual change in behavior, and then the events of that afternoon in excruciating detail. Dad listened without interrupting. His face remained calm, but I could see something dangerous building behind his eyes. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah," he finally said, "I need you to know that what happened to you today is not your fault. No one deserves to be treated that way, especially not by people who are supposed to love and protect them." I started crying again, all the emotions I had been holding back finally spilling over. Dad moved to sit beside me and held me while I sobbed. "I'm going to fix this," he said quietly. "But first, we need to take care of you." Over the next few weeks, Dad worked methodically. His head investigator, Marcus Chen, had been with his company for 15 years and knew exactly how to gather information legally and thoroughly. Marcus arranged for a lawyer, helped me gather my things from Michael's house, while he was at work, and set me up in a beautiful apartment across town. Dad also had Marcus look deeper into Michael's family background, saying he wanted to understand exactly who these people were who thought they could treat his daughter this way. What Marcus found over the following month was disturbing. Linda had been married twice before Robert, and both previous marriages had ended badly with accusations of emotional abuse. Robert had a history of gambling debts and had declared bankruptcy twice. Most importantly, Michael had been lying about how he got his job at my father's company. It turned out that Linda had somehow discovered that David Peterson was my father and had orchestrated Michael's pursuit of me. She had encouraged him to apply for the job at Dad's company, fed him information about my interests and schedules so he could accidentally run into me, and basically planned our entire relationship from the beginning. They had been using me to get access to my father's wealth and influence, and when they realized that Dad wasn't just going to hand over money or business opportunities, they had gotten frustrated. The explosion that day had been building for months. They had expected more benefits from having me in the family, and when those didn't materialize, I became a target for their anger. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. They thought my father was just another wealthy businessman who would write off his daughter's failed marriage and move on. They had no idea who they were actually dealing with. David Peterson hadn't just built his business empire through smart investments and hard work. He had also learned how to protect what was his, and I was his most precious possession. He had been investigating Michael's family since the day I brought him home, just as he did with anyone who got close to his family. He had known about their financial problems, their history, everything. But he had let the marriage proceed because I seemed happy, and he believed in letting me make my own choices. Now, however, they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The first thing Dad did was fire Michael. Not just fire him, he made sure that word spread through professional networks that Michael Henderson was unreliable and had serious character issues. Dad didn't make threats or spread lies, he simply shared the factual details of what had happened to me with key people in the industry. Business leaders drew their own conclusions about what kind of employee Michael would be. But that was just the beginning. Robert, it turned out, had been embezzling money from his employer, a mid-sized accounting firm. Marcus had uncovered evidence of this through routine financial background checks, and Dad turned it over to the authorities. Robert was arrested 6 weeks after the incident at the house. Linda lost her job shortly after that when her employer received documentation that she had been falsifying expense reports for years. The evidence had been legally obtained by Marcus during his investigation. Michael, meanwhile, was struggling to find employment in his field. While Dad hadn't actively blacklisted him everywhere, the business community is smaller than people think, and word travels. Michael's treatment of his wife had become known, and many employers simply didn't want to take the risk of hiring someone with such serious character flaws. The house they lived in, it turned out, was mortgaged to the hilt. Without Robert's income and with Michael unemployed, they couldn't make the payments. The bank began foreclosure proceedings within a month. But Dad wasn't done. He had been quietly working with financial partners to purchase their debts through legitimate channels. Credit cards, medical bills, the mortgage on the house, a loan Robert had taken out to pay gambling debts. Dad's investment group had legally purchased these debts from the original creditors over several months. It was all above board, but now he held significant leverage over their financial situation. 5 months after they threw me out of the house in a towel, they were informed that several of their major debts had been consolidated under new management and were being called for immediate payment. They had 60 days to pay in full or face legal action. The amount was over $150,000. They tried to contact me, of course. Michael called, texted, even showed up at my apartment building, though security turned him away. His messages went from angry to pleading to desperate. He claimed he still loved me, that his parents had pressured him, that he wanted to work things out. Linda tried a different approach. She sent letters claiming that she had always liked me and that the whole thing had been a misunderstanding. She said she wanted to make amends and rebuild our relationship. Robert, facing prison time for embezzlement, had his lawyer reach out to see if there might be some way to resolve our differences amicably. I ignored them all. On Dad's advice, I saved every message and documented every contact attempt, but I never responded. The final phase of consequences came 8 months later. Dad had been patient, methodical, letting their desperation build. When they were at their lowest point, facing potential homelessness and bankruptcy, he made his final moves. His investment group acquired several properties in their area, including the apartment complex where they had been forced to move after losing their house. The new management raised rents to market rate, which they could barely afford. Dad also used his business connections to ensure that certain opportunities simply weren't available to them, not through active sabotage, but through the natural consequences of their damaged reputations. Every aspect of their lives became more difficult. Not impossible, Dad was careful never to do anything illegal or completely destructive. But every day became a struggle, every interaction a reminder that their actions had consequences. Michael finally managed to get a job at a fast food restaurant on the other side of town. Linda found work as a night cleaner at an office building. Robert, after serving his sentence for embezzlement, got a job at a car wash. They were surviving, but just barely, and they knew exactly why their lives had fallen apart. The divorce was finalized 10 months after that horrible day. Michael didn't contest it, he couldn't afford a lawyer, and Dad's legal team made it clear that fighting would only make things worse for him. I got everything I wanted, which wasn't much since we hadn't accumulated many assets during our short marriage. During those months leading up to the finalization, I learned more about my father's methods and the extent of his network than I had ever known before. He would occasionally update me on the situation, not out of cruelty, but because he wanted me to understand that justice was being served and that I was safe. "Sarah," he told me one evening over dinner, "I want you to know that everything Marcus and I are doing is legal and above board. We're not breaking any laws or doing anything that could come back to hurt you. But we are using every legitimate tool at our disposal to make sure these people understand the gravity of their actions." He explained how business really worked at his level, the intricate networks of favors, information, and influence that most people never see. "When someone hurts my family," he said, "they're not just dealing with me. They're dealing with everyone who has an interest in maintaining good relationships with me. And that's a lot of people." I learned that Michael had tried to reach out to some of Dad's business partners, hoping to find someone who might put in a good word for him. What he didn't realize was that Dad's reputation in the business community was built on decades of fair dealing and loyalty to those who earned it. When word spread about how Michael had treated me, it only reinforced Dad's decision to cut ties with him completely. "The business world is smaller than people think," Dad explained. "Reputation is everything, and word travels fast. Michael's behavior toward you wasn't just a personal failing, it showed a fundamental lack of character that makes him unreliable in any context." Linda had tried a different approach. She had attempted to use her connections from her book club and social circles to pressure me into reconciliation. Several of the wives of Dad's business associates received calls from her, asking them to intercede on her family's behalf. This backfired spectacularly. These women, many of whom had daughters of their own, were horrified when they learned the details of what had happened to me. Instead of helping Linda, they began spreading the story throughout their own social networks. Within weeks, Linda found herself ostracized from the very social circles she had been trying to use for support. She made a critical error, Dad observed with something that might have been amusement. She assumed that other mothers would prioritize social harmony over protecting young women from abuse. She was very wrong about that. One of the most satisfying moments came when Mrs. Wellington, the wife of one of Dad's oldest business partners, called me directly. She was a formidable woman in her 70s who had raised 4 successful daughters and was known for her no-nonsense approach to life. "My dear," she said in her crisp, upper-class accent, "I just wanted you to know that what happened to you is absolutely unacceptable. I've spoken to several other mothers in our circle, and we want you to know that you have our full support. If that dreadful woman or her family tries to approach any of us again, they'll get a very different reception than they're expecting." It turned out that Linda's attempts to garner sympathy had created a network of powerful women who were actively working to ensure that the Henderson family remained persona non grata in their social circles. These weren't vengeful actions, they were protective ones. The women genuinely wanted to make sure that no other young woman would be vulnerable to the kind of treatment I had received. During this period, I also learned more about Michael's true character than I had discovered in 3 years of marriage. Marcus had uncovered a pattern of behavior that stretched back to his college days. He had dated several women before me, and in each case, the relationship had ended badly when the woman had finally stood up to his controlling behavior or his family's interference. One ex-girlfriend, Amanda, had actually reached out to me through a mutual friend after hearing about my situation. We met for coffee, and her story was eerily similar to mine. Michael had been charming and attentive at first, but once he felt secure in the relationship, he had started changing. He became critical, dismissive, and increasingly aligned with his parents' opinions about what she should and shouldn't do. The final straw for me was when Linda told me that my career goals were unrealistic for a woman, Amanda told me. When I looked to Michael for support, he just shrugged and said his mother had a point. That's when I knew I had to get out. Unlike me, Amanda hadn't had a powerful father to help her. She had simply endured months of emotional abuse before finally finding the strength to leave on her own. Learning about her experience made me realize how fortunate I had been to have Dad's support and resources. "Don't feel guilty about having advantages," Amanda told me when I expressed this thought. "Feel grateful, and use those advantages to help other people when you can. Your father's response sent a message that this kind of behavior has consequences. That might help the next woman who finds herself in a similar situation. Her words stayed with me and influenced how I handled the next phase of my recovery. Instead of just focusing on rebuilding my own life, I started volunteering with organizations that help women leaving abusive relationships. I used my graphic design skills to create materials for shelters and support groups, and I quietly funded several programs that helped women get back on their feet after leaving toxic situations. Dad was proud when I told him about this work. "You're turning a terrible experience into something that helps others," he said. "That's the kind of strength that can't be taught, it has to be earned." A year later, I was thriving. I had expanded my graphic design business, moved into a beautiful house that Dad helped me buy, and was dating a wonderful man named James who treated me like a queen. Dad had insisted on thoroughly investigating James too, but this time his report came back clean. James was exactly what he appeared to be, a kind, successful architect who adored me. Linda, Michael, and Robert, meanwhile, were still struggling. They had managed to avoid complete destitution, but their lives were a shadow of what they had been before. Michael was still working at the fast food place, living in a tiny apartment, and driving a 15-year-old car. Linda had developed health problems from the stress and was working 2 jobs to make ends meet. Robert was trying to rebuild his life after prison, but his criminal record made everything difficult. I learned all this from Dad's investigator, who continued to monitor them. Not because Dad was still actively making their lives difficult, by then, he had moved on to other concerns, but because he wanted to make sure they never tried to retaliate against me. One day, about 2 years after the incident, I was grocery shopping when I ran into Michael. He looked terrible, thin, tired, with a kind of defeated posture that comes from months of constant stress. He saw me and stopped dead in his tracks. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I was wearing a beautiful dress, my hair and makeup perfect, clearly happy and successful. He was in his fast food uniform, looking like life had beaten him down. "Sarah," he said quietly. "Michael," I replied, my voice neutral. "You look good," he said, and I could hear the pain in his voice. "Thank you." He hesitated, then said, "I know I don't deserve to ask, but is there any chance? Could you talk to your father? Maybe if I apologized, if I made amends." I looked at him for a long moment, remembering the man I had fallen in love with in college. That person seemed like a stranger now, and I realized that maybe he always had been. "Michael," I said gently, "what happened that day wasn't just about one afternoon. It was about who you chose to be when things got difficult. It was about how you treated someone you claimed to love. My father didn't destroy your life, you destroyed it when you decided to throw your wife out of the house wearing nothing but a towel." His face crumpled, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for him. "Almost." "I was scared," he whispered. "My parents, they had so much influence over me, and I was scared of standing up to them. I know that's not an excuse, but you're right," I said. "It's not an excuse." I walked away then, leaving him standing in the grocery store aisle. I felt lighter somehow, like a chapter of my life had finally, truly closed. As I drove home to my beautiful house, where James was waiting with dinner and flowers, I thought about that terrible day 2 years ago. At the time, it had felt like the end of the world. I had been humiliated, betrayed, and abandoned by the people who were supposed to love me most. But in reality, it had been the beginning of a better life. It had shown me who people really were, including myself. I had learned that I was stronger than I thought, that I deserved better treatment than I had been accepting, and that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you is actually the best thing. My father had taught me something important through his response to that situation. He showed me that love isn't just about being there for the good times, it's about protecting the people you care about when they can't protect themselves. He had seen me at my lowest, most vulnerable moment, and he had acted with quiet, devastating effectiveness to make sure that the people who hurt me understood the consequences of their actions. Some people might say what he did was excessive, that he went too far in his revenge. But I disagree. He didn't destroy them completely, they were all still alive, still capable of rebuilding their lives if they chose to learn from their mistakes. What he did was make sure that their actions had proportionate consequences. Linda had spent years being cruel to people she perceived as beneath her, and now she understood what it felt like to struggle. Robert had stolen money and manipulated people for his own gain, and now he was learning to live honestly. Michael had chosen to prioritize his parents' approval over his wife's dignity, and now he was learning what it meant to be truly alone. The last I heard, they were all still in the same city, still working their low-wage jobs, still dealing with the consequences of that day. Michael had tried dating a few times, but word had gotten around about how he had treated his wife, and decent women weren't interested. Linda had tried to rebuild her social circle, but her former friends had learned about her involvement in Michael's treatment of me and had distanced themselves. Robert was just trying to stay out of trouble and rebuild some semblance of a normal life. They weren't suffering dramatically, they had food, shelter, and safety. But they were experiencing the natural consequences of their choices, and those consequences served as daily reminders that actions have weight in the world. As for me, I was happier than I had ever been. James and I got engaged on the 2-year anniversary of my divorce, and Dad threw us a beautiful engagement party. My business was thriving, I had genuine friendships with people who respected and valued me, and I woke up every morning in a home filled with love and laughter. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if my father hadn't arrived that day, if I had been forced to handle the situation entirely on my own. I think I would have survived. I'm stronger than I used to think, but it would have been much harder. Having someone in your corner who loves you unconditionally and has the power to help makes all the difference in the world. The incident also taught me to pay attention to red flags in relationships. I realized that there had been signs of Michael's true character long before that day, but I had ignored them because I wanted so desperately to believe in the fairy tale of our love story. Now I knew better. Now I understood that real love shows itself in how someone treats you when they're angry, stressed, or pressured by other people. James had already passed that test multiple times. When his friends made jokes at my expense, he shut them down immediately. When his family had questions about my past marriage, he made it clear that the subject was off limits. When we disagreed about something, he listened to my perspective and worked with me to find solutions. He was exactly the kind of man I should have married in the first place. My father's response to that terrible day had been swift and decisive, but it had also been educational. I learned that you don't have to be cruel or vindictive to hold people accountable for their actions. You just have to be strategic, patient, and thorough. Dad had never once raised his voice or made threats. He had simply used his resources and connections to ensure that natural consequences followed naturally from their choices. The most beautiful part of the whole story was how it ended up bringing Dad and me closer together. We had always had a good relationship, but seeing him spring into action to protect me when I was at my most vulnerable created a bond between us that was unbreakable. I knew that no matter what happened in my life, I had someone who would always be in my corner. And Michael, Linda, and Robert learned that when you hurt someone, you're not just hurting them, you're potentially making an enemy of everyone who loves them. They had assumed that I was isolated and powerless, just a young woman they could push around without consequences. They had no idea that behind me stood a man with the resources and determination to make their lives very difficult if they chose to treat his daughter badly. The last time I saw any of them was at a coffee shop about 6 months ago. Linda was there with a woman I didn't recognize, and she looked older and more tired than her years. When she saw me, her face went white, and she quickly gathered her things and left. She never made eye contact, never acknowledged me, just fled like I was some kind of ghost from her past. In a way, I suppose I was. I represented the life she might have had if she had chosen to be kind instead of cruel, if she had welcomed her son's wife instead of viewing me as a threat. But she had made her choices, and now she was living with the results. I felt nothing when I saw her, no anger, no satisfaction, no pity. She was just a stranger now, someone who had briefly been part of my story but who no longer had any relevance to my life. That, more than anything, told me that I had truly moved on. Dad and I still laugh sometimes about how they thought they could manipulate and control us. They had seen a wealthy father and his young daughter and assumed we would be easy targets for their schemes. They had no idea that Dad had built his fortune by being smarter and more strategic than people who tried to take advantage of him, and that I had inherited more of his backbone than anyone realized. Looking back now, I'm actually grateful that everything happened the way it did. If Michael and his family had been more subtle in their treatment of me, if they had managed to hide their true nature longer, I might have spent years in that toxic environment. I might have had children with Michael, making it much harder to leave. I might have gradually lost myself trying to please people who were never going to accept me. Instead, their cruelty and stupidity had exposed them completely, giving me the chance to escape before any permanent damage was done. And my father's response had ensured that I could move forward without fear of retaliation or continued harassment. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is having your worst day, because that's when you discover who you really are and who really loves you. It's when you learn what you're capable of surviving and what you absolutely will not tolerate. I am a different woman now than I was that day when I sat shivering on the porch in a towel. I'm stronger, wiser, and much more selective about who I allow into my inner circle. I'm also more grateful for the people who have proven themselves worthy of my trust and love. And somewhere across town, 3 people are living with a daily reminder that actions have consequences, that cruelty creates enemies, and that sometimes the person you hurt has a father who believes in making sure justice is served, quietly and thoroughly. It was the perfect revenge, and they never saw it coming.